Welcome to Genesis to Exodus from Family to Nation with Rabbi David Silber. This is our fourth session in this 9-part series, which is a continuation of Rabbi Silber's ongoing Sunday morning classes on Genesis. This class is on the construction of the family of Israel, which takes place in the concluding chapters of Genesis, the book of Exodus, referring to the formation of the nation. And these ongoing sessions will focus on nation building in Exodus and the relation of family and nation as reflected in the first several chapters of Exodus. We have the pleasure of learning with Rabbi Silber, the Dean of Dresha. And just one moment of housekeeping. I will be sending invitations to panelists. I see a whole lot of people are coming in. That's great. If you are a panelist, you can unmute yourself. You can turn your camera on. You can ask questions more directly. You do not have to teach the class. You just get to ask things more easily. If you're in a place where you can do that, I recommend accepting that invitation. But as always, you can ask questions in chat, both on Zoom and on Facebook Live. And if you want to stay an attendee but ask questions, feel free to use the little raise hand button and I will make it so you can speak. If you have your preferred Tanakh, please keep it at hand. Otherwise, I'll be sharing sources from Sfaria on screen. And with that brief introduction over, Rabbi Silber, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'd like now to we'll move quickly through the rest of chapter 49, and hopefully next week finish up Reshit, if possible, and then we'll start with Shemot. So the idea is, Reshit, of course, is about the building of the family, and which is the model for the nation in the next book. And the idea is the transition from family to nation, which is the main theme of the overall of these sessions. So in chapter 49, just to review very quickly, Yaakov is blessing all of his sons. By blessing all of his sons, I don't mean they all get the same blessing. And in fact, some of them, one can wonder whether, in our terms, we might call it a blessing altogether. It seems more of a critique when it comes to, for example, Shimon and Levi, whom he brings together. He talks to them both together. His main point being that when they're together, there's a problem. And therefore, he talks about prophesies or when he informs them that at some point in the future, they will be divided. So they're divided. We talked about that. Reuven is stripped of the rights of the firstborn. So son number 1, 2, and 3, he doesn't expel them from the family. That's a very important point. And the Torah makes that point more than once. For example, in verse number 28 of this chapter, Kol elu shivtei Yisrael shnei mosar. V'zot asher diber lahem avihem vayivarech otam ish asher kibirchato beirach otam. So it's clear, these are all the tribes of Israel. It talks about them of the tribes of Israel. It's talking about the future. The individual people will become tribes. But he makes it clear, these are the 12. There are 12 tribes. Number 12 is a significant number in this book. Family, when in the Torah, when Jacob is blessed, it's always, or if someone blesses, it's always 12 that we discussed. In any event, nobody gets excluded. And the point is that was Jacob's commitment, Jacob's dream. Jacob's life's work is to try to build his family. Of course, it wasn't so simple. And we talked about how he managed to include Yosef, he managed to include Rachel, back in chapter 48. He even gives Joseph a double portion through Manasseh and Ephraim. And in chapter 49, every one of his sons is included in the family. But the first three certainly, their blessing is perhaps more of a critique than a blessing. And then we come to Yehuda. And Yehuda, Midrashim point out, Yehuda ata yoducha achecha. Judah, your yoducha. Question is what yoducha means, and there are several possibilities. That you're different, Judah. Either the brothers praise you, that's one possibility. Commentaries are divided. It could be they acknowledge you, which I like very much. And there's a third possibility, actually, that the word yoducha, perhaps, I don't know if it's etymologically accurate, but the word yoducha in the text even plays off the word hod. Hod, which is majesty, and can be identified with kingship. Because the blessing of Judah, actually, and this is the important point, the blessing of Judah is a blessing of kingship. That is to say, the brother who will lead the brothers in Jacob's blessings in chapter 49 is none other than Yehuda. That's actually a very, very important point about Yaakov. As much as Yaakov loves Yosef, and he certainly does, as much as Yaakov favored Yosef, and he certainly did, and as much as Yaakov gives Joseph the extra portion, one might say he gives Rachel's firstborn the rights of the firstborn, takes it away from Reuven. He's already given it to Joseph through Manasseh and Ephraim. As much as all that is true, and as much as he spoke to Joseph about his return to the land and God speaking to him and God promising him more children and your children are my children, and all that is true. But when it comes to the leadership of the family, the kingship, leadership or kingship, that's given to Judah. And that's explicit in verse number 10 of chapter 49, a verse that is very, very famous. Has all kinds of Christological, this verse is incredibly significant. We're not getting into it, but chapter 49, verse 10, one of the famous verses of the Bible. Very unclear what it actually means, but what it certainly says, for sure, the first part says that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. In other words, the scepter and the staff, the shevet and mechokek, will not depart from Judah. That is to say, that Judah will be the leader. No other tribe, just Judah. I want to make 2 points about this verse. The first half is clear. It's the second part of the verse that's very unclear. But I want to make the point that the shevet and the mechokek shall not depart from Judah, lo yosur. That is clearly the reference in the Chumash here is to the story of Judah and Tamar. We spoke about that story in the past many times. It is, in my way of thinking, from the plot standpoint of Genesis, the critical story. It's a demonstration that actually family can exist, and that two siblings can share a blessing. That's the point of the story. But in that story, you recall when Judah meets Tamar, who stands on the road, he thinks she's a prostitute, and he wants to come to her, and she says, you have to pay me. You have to pay me. Oh, I'll send you a goat later on. She says, no, we don't accept that here. This is a payment. Payment is now. Give me something now that ensures that I'll get paid. What do you want? He asks her, what do you want? And she says, back in chapter 38, I want your seal, I want your staff, and petilecha, fringes, I want your coat. These are all symbols of kingship and leadership. And he gives those things to her. He gives away, one might say, the symbols of his kingship, of his leadership. The point of that story is, of course, nothing that he's done in chapter 38 has demonstrated that he's fit to lead anybody. Quite the opposite. She, on the other hand, has a plan to somehow rebuild the family. So she's the one who should possess the staff and the seal and the coat. So that's a very important story. He gets it back through his confession and taking responsibility. And now what Yaakov's blessing to Judah is, I would say, never again will the staff and the seal leave you. Now, the word for staff and seal in the story in chapter 38 was chotam and mateh. And over here, in this poetic rendition, it is shevet and mechokek, but they are synonymous. And the larger point over here, well, 2 points. First of all, that what Judah learns in the Judah Tamar story about taking responsibility and confession is what he employs later on in the story of Binyamin. He's the one who says, "Manitz tadak." We have no way. We can't justify what we do. Manitz tadak tzadka mimeni. It's the same shoresh tzadi daled kuf. And then he says to Joseph, whom he doesn't know is Joseph, Avdecha arav etanar, because I am the guarantor. I'm the security for this boy. It's what he said to his father Yaakov, Anochi erevenu. I'm the arev. It's my responsibility. I made a commitment and I'm responsible. Don't blame anybody else. I'm the guy responsible. Any good leader understands that the person in charge is the one responsible. Any leader who doesn't accept that responsibility is not much of a leader, obviously. So Judah is the one who accepted responsibility. And now the point is that, and that story, and you learn that from Tamar, actually, about what it means to take responsibility. And that's what enables the family to actually to come together, is Judah's confession, which breaks Joseph down, and Joseph reveals his identity, and then can be included in the family. Yaakov takes it further. Yaakov finds ways to bring them together. So here, my point about the blessings that we have in chapter 49, the second point is that the blessings of Yaakov in chapter 49 are related to the stories that we have studied earlier. For example, last week we talked about Reuven. It's not just that Reuven sleeps with Bilhah, but his whole behavior throughout the book, in more than one story, a couple of other stories, demonstrates that even though he may be a good guy, may have good intentions, but he doesn't know how to take responsibility. He doesn't know how to lead. Not in the sale of Joseph's story, not when he blames the brothers in Egypt, and not when he tells his father, "You can kill my two sons if I don't bring Benjamin back." That's not leadership. You want to take responsibility yourself. You have to be able to influence other people. So the point of the brachot are they're not completely unrelated to the narratives that come before. They're very much connected. And Judah emerges in this book and clearly in the blessing as the leader, as the one might say as the future king. And part of being a king in general is somebody that people can actually relate to. Judah is somebody that the brothers can respect, and therefore he can be a king. Joseph, on the other hand, they may respect him in a certain way, but they never really trust him, and they never can understand him. Joseph is a different way to see the world, and therefore, as talented as he may be, he can actually be the leader of the brothers. That is the point I wanted to emphasize here. Now, when you look at this chapter 49, and I'll stop in a few minutes to take comments and questions. What's clear about chapter 49 is there are two brothers that stand out because their blessings are much longer than any others. And the two obviously are Judah, whose blessing begins in verse number 8, verse 8 and verse 9 and verse 10 and verse 11 and verse 12. It gets five verses. So that's a long blessing. That's Judah. And the only other brother who gets a long blessing is, of course, Joseph. And that starts in the same chapter, in that chapter, verse 22, and 22, 23, 24, 25, and verse number 26. It's also 5 verses. So those two stand out. They're much longer than anybody else, and it makes perfect sense. Of course, in the story that we've been looking at, namely the book of Genesis, in the latter part of the book, there are two brothers that stand out. There's Joseph, obviously, at the center, and then there's Yehuda, Judah and Tamar being a pivotal story. And of course, Judah is the one who is able to bring the family together. Judah is the one that Joseph sends ahead. Yaakov sends ahead, and Judah goes to Pharaoh. So the point is, it is clear that in the story, in the blessings, they all get blessed, but Yehuda and Yosef are singled out. Now, I want to mention something else over here. I'm not going to go through all these different brothers, but I did want to mention something that I saw in more than one recent source, people that write about Genesis, and I want to mention what they say. They both say the same thing. It's probably many people who have said this. And then I want to add something that they don't say. When you read this chapter, so the brothers get blessed, and there's certain things that are interesting about the blessings in general. One of them is that that some of the brothers, that it specifically mentions the land that they will inhabit. It talks about, for example, the fifth blessing, Zevulun, in verse number 13, Zevulun l'chof amim yishkon, v'hu l'chof oniyot v'yarchato al Sidon. So Zevulun will dwell by the seashore. He will be a haven for ships, we'll have docks, and so it means do business. There'll be all kinds of boats coming in and out. And he will rest. He will rest. His flank will be on Sidon. We know what Sidon is. Sidon is north. In Israel, in the north, Tsar and Sidon. So it's very specific about where Zebulun ultimately will find his portion in the land. That is clear. The next one is maybe as well, Yisachar Chamor Gorem Rovetz Ben HaMishpatayim. It's not exactly clear, but he crouches among the sheepfolds. Where else do you have? Who else is, let's see, mentioned? Well, those two for sure are mentioned. Let's see. Not clear. In other words, some of them, very brief blessings, but it either talks about their geographical location or it talks about what they will produce, from which we probably can infer to some extent where they're going to be. Some of them are not clear. Naftali Ayala Shulcha Hanotenim Reishafer. So the point is the commentaries are divided. I'm not going to go into it now, but the commentaries are divided on the specifics of some of these blessings. But basically, it would appear for some of them, it talks about where they're going to live, either geographically explicit or the kind of land they will inherit. And they have short blessings. And the order is interesting as well. The order is not precisely the order of the births. It does begin with the 6 sons of Leah. It ends with the 2 sons of Rachel. What's interesting is, and this is what they noticed, in terms of the structure of chapter 49, there's one thing that stands out in chapter 49, which is obvious to the reader. And that is that in the middle of Jacob blessing all of his sons, we have verse number 18. Lishuatcha kiviti Hashem. 3 words. God, I wait for your deliverance, oh God. Lishuatcha kiviti Hashem. And the question is, what in the world are these 3 words doing in the middle of Jacob's blessing? Well, I want to make 2 points. One is not a point that's original with me. Many others have said it. And then there's something that is original with me that I said many years ago, which I like very much, and I will say that once again. But first of all, the question is, Lishuatcha kiviti Hashem. To whom is Jacob addressing these words, if anybody? It comes up in terms when you read the Chumash, it sounds like it's part of the blessing that Yaakov gives to Dan, which begins in verse 16. Dan yadinamo ki achad shiftei Yisrael, ki dan nachash ale derech shififon ale orach, hanoshech ikvesus vayipol rochvo achar. So Dan will be a serpent by the road, snake, a viper by the path. Shififon is another word for nachash. Reminds us of the verse back in the story of Gan Eden, where God said to the snake, you'll be the eternal enemy of the children of the woman. Humanity and the snake are enemies. But he will smite you in the head and you will smite him in the heel. Yeshufcha. So therefore, the word shififon presumably is related to what God had said to the snake back in chapter 3, Yeshufcha. In any event, Dan, and this is also true of the blessings, that several of the tribes are presented in terms of animals. Yehuda is a lion. Gur Aryeh Yehuda. Dan is a snake. Binyamin is a wolf. Binyamin is the Av Yitraf. Binyamin is a wolf. Yosef, depending on how we read verse number 22, may be a wild ass. It's Bein Porat Yosef. Maybe I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes, what Bein Porat means. But the point is, anyway, and then Lishuatcha kiviti Hashem. So it sounds like Lishuatcha kiviti Hashem is part of Dan's blessing. But what does it have to do with Dan's blessing? It doesn't sound like a blessing at all. It sounds like a prayer. Let's leave that aside for a moment. So let's assume, and this is what many assume, that it's not connected to anybody. It actually, in the middle of Jacob blessing his children, in the middle, he makes a difference. He turns away from the children for a second, turns to God. Maybe he mumbles under his breath. Lishuatcha kiviti Hashem. So what they noticed actually, and they take it, there's slight variations, but what they noticed actually is that Lishuatcha kiviti Hashem, which appears in the middle of Jacob's blessings of his sons is actually a marker which sort of divides, which sort of suggests a kind of structure to the chapter. In other words, that the kind of chiastic structure, the blessings that precede the Lishuat Lakiviti Hashem, the blessings that follow, God Gedud Yigudenu, Me'asher Shmeinu Alachmo, and Naftali Ayala Shlucha, and those three blessings to God and to Asher and to Naphtali are parallel to, one might say, to the three tribes that precede. The tribes that precede would be, well, Dan is found in verse number 16. Yisachar and Zvulun are verses 15, 13, and 14. In other words, three tribes that follow, let me say three of the minor tribes that follow, are parallel to the three minor tribes that precede. And then after the three tribes that follow, you have Joseph. And before the three tribes that precede, you have Judah. So it underscores the parallel between Yehuda and Yosef. These are the two leading tribes, which ultimately become the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom being the kingdom of Joseph, also sometimes called Ephraim, and the southern kingdom is Judah. So this is the more or less, without getting some of the specifics, that's more or less what they suggest. And they suggest that, by division, it allows us to make all kinds of other connections between the tribes that precede and the tribes that follow. I guess the main point would be, and it underscores the fact that amongst the tribes, there are two that stand out. There's Judah before Lishuatcha, and there's Joseph after Lishuatcha Kiviti Hashem, which is fine and good. And I think there is something to that, but it doesn't actually explain the words Lishuatcha Kiviti Hashem. Why does Jacob say these three words in the middle of the blessing of his sons? So before I stop for a break, I wanted to make a suggestion. I made the suggestion 40 years ago. Sometimes when you say something a long time ago, over time, it happens all the time, we rethink it and we come up with something much better. I must confess that in this particular instance, I have not come up with anything better, and I actually still like what I said then, which is this. It's a puzzle. Lishuat Lakiviti Hashem. What does that? It has nothing to do with his children. So, but the suggestion that I made many years ago is the following, after which I'll stop and take comments, questions. But actually, it's connected to Dan, but not in the way, it's not a blessing to Dan. The blessing to Dan in verse number 16, Dan Yodinamo Ki Achad Shiftei Yisrael. So Dan Yodinamo, could be here they translate to govern, but din often means to punish. Din is judgment, and then the blessing describes how Dan will be, what Dan is going to do. He's the snake who attacks the enemy. He bites the ikvei sus, because snakes bite you with the heel, and here it's the heel of the sus. It's the horse's heels. Vayipol roch boachar, and the rider is thrown off. Dan will fight. And Jacob blesses Dan. And as Jacob is blessing Dan, Jacob is reminded, and we, the reader, are reminded about this word Dan. The word Dan appears very significantly when chapter 4 rescues Lot and saves the people that the four kings have captured. But in the next chapter, chapter 15, the great covenant, the Brit Ben Abitarim, God speaks to Abraham, know very well, Yodoa Teda, Ki Yeh Yezaracha B'Eretz Lo Lahem, V'Avodum V'Inu Otam Arba Me'ot Shana. God says to Abraham, know very well, your descendants will be strangers, they'll be enslaved and persecuted for 400 years. That's the covenantal. Those are the covenantal terms that Jacob himself endured in the house of Lavan, as we have studied. And Israel will endure in the land of Egypt, in the very beginning of the book of Exodus. Vayanunu, vayavidu, inui and abdut. Moshe said, "Gera yiti b'eretz nachriyah." And the verse afterwards, after God says to Abraham, your descendants will be Gerim and Avadim, and Inui will take place in chapter 15. And the very next verse is, but the nation that enslaves them, I will be done. I will judge and punish the nation that enslaves them. That's the end of the blessing of done. And then what Yaakov says to himself, he says to himself the following: I have just given a blessing to done, which he said himself in the beginning of chapter 49. Let me tell you what's going to happen at the end of days. Whatever end of days means, it probably doesn't mean the end of all days, but it means in the distant future. He talks about the tribe, talks about kingship. There are references to events that take place in the book of Shoftim, in the book of Shmuel. And suddenly Jacob says to himself, here I am talking about being done in the future. But what about in the present? What about right now? After all, Jacob and Jacob alone understands at this point that the Jewish people are already in exile, that the Jewish people are in a place in which they're going to be enslaved just 2 chapters away from now. And there's going to be Inui, and they're going to be seen as foreigners and marginalized, Gerus, Avdus, and Inui. And not only that, he prophesied about Dan. How does Dan fight in Jacob's blessing? He said he fights. He's the snake on the road, on the path that bites the horse, and the rider falls off. Well, the horse and the rider in the Torah, that's a symbol of Egypt.
Yashir.
Of course, isn't it obvious? So as Yashir, but it's but I'll tell you, it's even better because he's thinking, but no one else understands. And of course, he says it to himself because his kids have no clue. They're happy to be in Mitzrayim. Business is good. But Jacob understands, and Jacob turns to God and says, God, forget about the distant future. We need redemption right now. We need someone who will take care of the Sus and the Rechev. And the Oz Yashir is very correct, but let me say even more than Oz Yashir. It is Oz Yashir. It's Oz Yashir when we are redeemed from Egypt, when we cross the sea, the Yam Suf, Ozi v'zimrat ka, right? Shir al Hashem ki ga'o ga'ah. That's how it's done. Sus v'rochvo ramah v'yam. Right? The horse and the rider he threw into the Yam. And what's the next verse? Ozi v'zimrat ka v'yehili lishua. It's exactly what Jacob said. Lishuat kiviti Hashem. It's exactly what does happen. God throws the horse and the rider into the sea, and the people all sing, Vayhili Lishua. This is Jacob's prayer. So this is the point. It may be a marker. I read a couple of different young Israeli scholars. The Israelis love to look at the structure all the time, which is important, but I think they a bit overdo it. In any event, what's the words? Very nice, you got your structure. But why these 3 words? And the 3 words, of course, is we don't understand what they're doing here. But the point is, of course, the brothers don't understand what they're doing here either. In fact, it's not even clear he's talking to them. He's talking to himself, actually, or to God. He says, here I am blessing about Dan, the Sus and the Rechev and the Dan, but God, you yourself promised. And by the way, I would add to this, what I mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago, that actually Yaakov is aware of the text of the Brit Ben Habatarim. Because when Yaakov speaks to Joseph, and he promises Joseph the extra portion, he said to Joseph in chapter 49, if you recall, I give you Shchema Chalal Achecha, let's say an extra portion, more than your brothers, in the land, Asher Lakachti Miyado Emori Bicharbi Uvakashti, in the land that I will take from the Emori with my bow and sword. And the point is, he refers to the land of Canaan as Emori, but the land of Canaan is usually Canaani. Didn't say Eretz Canaan, Eretz Emori, because in the covenant to Abraham, right? God said to Abraham, "Dari v'yi yashuvu heina, ki lo shalem avono Emori ad heina." In the Brit Ben Habatarim, God refers to the land as Eretz Emori. And that's the term that Yaakov uses when he speaks to Yosef in chapter 49. He references the text of Bipin HaBetarim. So here as well, in chapter 49, that was 48. In 49, it's he recalls the text, that God will be done, having just talking about done and the sus and the rechev and throwing the rider off, then he turns aside. Kids have no understanding of this whatsoever. But he understands very well. He's going down to Mitzrayim. It's the beginning of the exile. Yaakov understands. He's afraid to go. And God said to Yaakov, don't be afraid. I'll be with you. And Yaakov accepts the task of going down to Mitzrayim. Says, right? Yaakov says, I'll go. Yaakov says, Hineni. Chapter 46, he said, Hineni. So this is the meaning, I think, and the great, great significance of Yeshua Takiviti Hashem. So I said 40 years ago, and I still like it. Doesn't mean we can't do better, but I do like it very much. Anyway, okay, I'll stop here and take comments or questions, and then we will move on to the next. There's a lot more here in terms of the individual tribes. I'm not going to get into it, but maybe we'll touch upon it a little later. But okay, anybody have any comments or questions? I would be happy to hear.
I have a question. In Kriyat Shema Al Amita, you say Lishuatcha Kiviti Hashem, and you play with the words.
Right.
It's like a mantra. Do you want to comment on that? Is that at all related to your idea here that it breaks things up and it's like a pre of what's coming?
Well, I would say that. I mean, I have nothing profound to say about it. Let's start with that. Yeah, it's said. You do also in Kiddush Levana. You have it, the same kind of thing. We have a Tipo Lei Motav Vafachad. Heaven did move. We play with it also. But I just assume it means because you're going to sleep, and who knows if you wake up in the morning. We like to believe we're going to wake up in the morning, but one never knows. So this idea of sleeping is 60th of death and all that is a kind of prayer. We hope for your salvation. We hope that wake up in the morning and we are reborn. The idea of being reborn every morning. We say that in our prayers. The world is reborn every morning. So I presume it has something to do with that. But yeah, we have adopted this prayer of Yaakov, which he says, I think he says it to himself, actually. I don't think he's talking to the brothers, because why would he even bother? They have no clue what he's talking about. Clearly, they have no idea. There's no sense, by the way, in the Chumash, as far as I can see, that the brothers have any idea of actually leaving Mitzrayim, because they stay there. They don't have to stay there. The family is long over, and they came initially on a temporary basis, but they never get out. And after a while, they can't get out. It's actually Yosef in the next chapter who will lecture the brothers about getting out, remarkably. But yes, I just assume it has something to do with just prior to going to sleep. The prayer that in the future, which is next morning, that God will, you'll be reborn and maybe some good things will happen. But
no, I agree. It's just
yeah.
the fact that they play with the order. That was
right.
what
So I don't know about
intrigued me.
that playing. We do that also in, I guess, again, in Kiddush Levana, which is also a kind of prayer. It's also from Shirat Hayam, by the way. Tipo Alei Me Motav Vafachad, which actually is interesting. The two places that we do that, as far as I can recall, one is Shirat Hayam itself, and the other is the three words that I claim are fulfilled in Shirat Hayam. So maybe this tradition, maybe consciously or unconsciously, is playing off that, because both of them go back to Shirat Hayam. Okay, anybody else for a comment or any other comment or question?
Just a comment in chat that is also a lovely song by Shlomo Katz.
Yes.
But other than that, it's been quiet in chat.
What about Shlomo Katz?
He has a beautiful melody set to these.
Oh, melody, right. I see. Right. Well, I mean, it's in our prayers. Ki Yeshuatcha kivinu kol hayom. And the Sephardic nusach is umitzapim Yeshua, which is Tarbach has a very, very good nigun for that, by the way. But some other time. And anyway, the point is, okay, so let's continue now. These are the blessings. There's more to say about the blessings, and I'll say one other thing about the blessings here, that when it comes to Joseph. So the blessing of Joseph, first let me just say in general, that when it comes to this chapter and other biblical poetry is much more difficult to interpret, as it were, to translate than the prose. Biblical poetry typically is, and that's the nature of poetry. It is, there are all kinds of allusions. There's all kinds of playing with, the Chumash does play with letters and words, but when it comes to poetry, it does it in spades. So the point is, it is very hard to know, actually. In the terms of Joseph, each verse presents us with certain problems. For example, let's take the first verse of verse 22 of chapter 49. Bein porat Yosef, bein porat ale ayin, banot sa'ada ale shur. So there are several terms here. We don't know what they mean. Let's start with the first word, bein. What is the bein over here? Bein porat Yosef. So the English translation we have before us, Joseph is a wild ass. They're taking porat, being related to the word pera, like with Yishmael. Hu yeh pera adam. He'll be a wild ass of a man. Pera adam. That's how they're translating porat. But what does bein porat mean? What does bein porat? So does it mean the son of a pera? In other words, like you have, for example, we have in the Chumash, the term for sometimes for cattle is bakar. Sometimes in the Chumash it's called ben bakar. Ben bakar. So ben porat could be ben pera. That's probably, it seems to me that's how JPS is translating it. That ben porat means like ben bakar. That's one possibility. And there's another possibility that Ben actually, and even according to this, that Ben means a son, right? Joseph, this is my son. If you stop Yaakov in the street, Yaakov, what's the name of your son? Oh, Joseph. Oh, I have other kids too, you know? You stopped Avram in the street in chapter 20. Who's your son? Or 21? Yishmael. That's his son, you know? It's my son. I prayed for him and whatever. So Ben could be a son, but there's another possibility for Ben, actually. And let me just, if you open to Psalm number 80. Psalm number 80. Let's see if we get Psalm number 80 on the screen here. Psalm number 80. Very, very beautiful psalm, by the way. One of the truly beautiful psalms we have. So this Psalm number 80. I'll wait till it's up on the screen. There it is. Truly, if you're not familiar with the psalm, you should read it. It's really one of the great psalms. So in this psalm, it references specifically Joseph. For example, let's see, the English would be, Roa Yisrael Hazina Noheg Katson Yosef, Yoshev HaKruvim Hofia. B'fnei Ephraim u'Binyamin u'Menashe, Ora Gevuratecha. As I'm reading the psalm now, which is one of my favorite psalms, I'm pretty sure, you know that every day of the week we are saying a psalm at the end of the service, right? On the first day it's with David Mizmah Hashem Haratzum Loa, etc. Shabbos Mizmah Shir Yom HaShabbos. Depending on the day of the week, we have different psalms for the day of the week. There is a tradition, which is in some places observed, in Israel particularly, and the Gra had this, that not only is there a special psalm, like Rosh Chodesh, we say Baruch Nafshi. On Rosh Chodesh, there's a special psalm for Rosh Chodesh. But for the most part, outside of Rosh Chodesh, we don't have any other special psalm. And even on Rosh Chodesh, we say it in addition to the psalm of the day. But there's another tradition that on all the special holidays, we don't say the psalm of the day. We say a different psalm for that particular day. And it's a whole list of psalms that is said for particular days. I'm pretty sure, 95% certain, that Psalm number 80 is the psalm they say in Israel for Shmini Atzeres. Shmini Atzeres, Simchas Torah, October 7th. This is the psalm actually, and it's a psalm about Yosef actually. Yoshev v'Hofio L'fnei Ephraim u'Binyamin u'Menashe Orah Turatecha u'Lecha Lishuat Olanu. You are enthroned on the Cheruvim, the head of Ephraim, Binyamin, and Menashe. These are the sons of Rachel, right? Rouse your might and come to our help. Lishuat Chafai. So Elohim Hashivenu Ha'er Ponecha V'Nivashea. Oh God, restore us, right? Show your favor that we may be delivered. Fine. Very appropriate psalm for our time. In any event, what I wanted to point out in this glorious psalm is that in verse number 9, the psalmist recalls the experience in Egypt. Starts with Geffen Mitzrayim Tasi. It compares Israel to a vine. You plucked up a vine from Egypt and you planted in the land. Okay, and then it goes on. And then in verse 15, Elohim Tzvaot Shuvna Habeit Mishamayim Urei Ufakod Geffen Zot. God, turn again, look down from heaven, and take note or deliver this Geffen, this vine. V'kanar she'noto yeminecha v'yalbein imatztalach. The stem you have taken as your own, the stock planted by your right hand, albein imatztalach. So what does bain mean over here? Here they translate stem, translated stem, but the point is it's something to do with the vine, right? Something that grows, a stem, or maybe it's some kind of, it's a growth, something that grows. Here it's part of the Geffen. Here Israel and Joseph specifically, who represents Israel, is compared to the ben. In verse number 18, the psalmist plays with it. Right? Grant your help to the one at your right hand, referring to the Joseph story again with Ephraim, right? Ben Adam and the person, the one you have taken as your own. So it's interesting, it's clear to me that the psalmist of Psalm number 80, this is a psalm for Asaph. There's many great psalms. And Asaph, actually, the psalmist Asaph, clearly is referencing the Joseph story. And I just got to wonder whether Ben Porat Yosef, Ben Porat Aleayin, Banot Soada Leshur is not a very different meaning for the, and which could actually be the pshat. Not that Joseph is a para, but Joseph is something that grows, a vine that grows. I would say a kind of fruitful vine, a porat, from the word with fruit. Joseph is a fruitful vine that grows by the spring, and banot sada aleshur, not wild coals on a hillside. I mean, no one knows what this means. It would guesswork, but that banot sada aleshur, that the vines that grow on the wall, sure, maybe being a wall, like ivy, it grows, it keeps going up. In other words, maybe it grows in such a way that you can't imagine it would grow, which is the story of Joseph, actually, if you think about it. It's somebody that, wherever you put this guy, doesn't matter, he manages somehow to make the best of the situation. And that's perhaps what's alluded to over here, that the Bain over here, going through the prism of Psalm number 80, which is a truly glorious psalm and one that's very striking in our present circumstances, that actually he's describing Joseph as something that's able to grow no matter where you put it. Bain Parata Le'ayin and Banot Soada Aleshur. And then he continues to reference the Joseph story, whether it's the brothers or not. Vayamaru Varobu, Vayistamu Ba'alei Chitzim, right? Vayistamu Ba'alei Chitzim, that somehow archers assailed him, they shot at him, they harried him. Fine. He was able, though, to be firm and to maintain himself. That's the blessing. And it may refer to, certainly logically refers to the story of Joseph and his brothers. In fact, in the very next chapter, the brothers think Joseph's going to take vengeance, take his revenge on them. Lu yistamenu Yosef. It uses the same term, Lu yistamenu Yosef. So the point is, it raises the question, which is a very good question. How much does Yaakov know about the Joseph story? The Chumash never tells us. I mean, I feel he knows plenty about it, but he never says directly anything about it. Now, here he hints at something, that they tried to harm him. They shot it in, they tried to harm him. In fact, they tried to kill him. But Yaakov is never explicit about it, never explicit. In any event, there's something about Joseph which is amazing, almost magical about Joseph. And then one other point about the Joseph blessing, which is at the end of the blessing, and there's a parallel blessing in Zota Bracha, a very similar blessing. Me'el avicha v'yazreka v'el shaddai v'voracheka v'kot shamayim me'al v'kot ha'om rovetzet tachat v'kot shaddai v'varacham. So when he speaks about Joseph's blessing, here the translation we have is, the God of your father who helps you, Shaddai, who blesses you, blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that couches below, blessings of the breast and womb. So the point is that this blessing that Yaakov confers upon Yosef specifically, B'kot Shamayim Me'al, B'kot Tahom Rovetzet Tachat, when you read those words of the blessing given to Yosef, it's hard not to be reminded of the blessing that Yaakov got from his father Yitzchak. Yitenucha Elohim, Vital Hashamayim Umishmanei Haaretz, V'rov Dagan V'tirosh. It's hard not to think of it. It sounds like that blessing that Yaakov got. Okay, he got it under problematic circumstances, but it's his blessing. As Yitzchak said, he's blessed. I gave that blessing to him. That's the blessing specifically that Yaakov confers upon Joseph. And what is striking about it is that when you think about it, the next verse that Yitzchak gave to Yaakov, thinking it's Esav, Yavducha mim yishtachavu lecha geumim hevei gvir liachecha yishtachavu lecha b'nei imecha. The point is that blessing, that they will bow down to you, is ultimately not the blessing Joseph gets. Of course, the brothers did bow down to Joseph in Egypt, but in point of fact, the idea of being Gvir liachecha, the one who is the primary one amongst the brethren, that's not Joseph, actually. The primary one, the king, the leader, is actually Judah. So that he doesn't give Joseph. But the blessing of the dew of the dew of heaven and the fats of the land, right, is parallel to Birkot Tahom Rovetz Tachat, Birkot Shaddai Varacham, etc. That blessing that he got when Isaac thinks he's Esau, that's the blessing that's conferred upon Joseph. And finally, the last word about Joseph's blessing, which I don't want to speak about now, I'll mention it, and I've taught in the past, is the description of Joseph at the end of the blessing. That all of these blessings, Tiyena l'rosh Yosef, u'kod kol nazir echav. These blessings should be upon the head of Joseph, upon the head of the one who was separated from his brethren. He calls Joseph a nazir echav. And as we've talked in the past, that Joseph is actually represented in the text as a kind of nazir, one who was separated. And it's interesting that the blessing is l'rosh Yosef. Of course, in the Torah, the nazir, what marks the nazir is he doesn't cut the hair on top of his head, right? His rosh nizro. And that this, in any event, that's another element of the Joseph blessing. And the beginning of this verse, in verse number 26, Birkot avicha gavua birkot horai, says Yaakov to Yosef, the blessings of your father surpass the blessings of my ancestors, or I would say in addition to, which actually fits very nicely with what I just said about the blessing that Yaakov got from Yitzchak, that blessing. Not the covenantal blessing, but the blessing Yaakov gets from Yitzchak when he thinks it's Esav, that blessing is given to Joseph. So Yaakov says, you have my blessing, Yosef, but you also have the blessing I took from my father. That I confer specifically upon you. Tala Shamayim Umishmani Aretz. So those are the three different elements of the Joseph blessing that I wanted to point out. And I point us all towards Psalm number 80, which is one of the most beautiful Psalms that we have. And I'm pretty sure it's the Psalm that's recited on Simchas Torah in Israel. Okay, I'll stop here for a moment, and if anybody has any comments or questions, I'll take that, and then we have still plenty of time to continue and to finish the chapter. Are there any comments or questions on this, anything with this chapter, chapter 49, before we move on to the completion?
It's been all quiet in chat.
All quiet. Okay. Then we will continue. All right. The chapter there's many things we didn't discuss in this chapter, but I just wanted to touch on some of the points I thought are very interesting in terms of Yehuda and Yosef's blessings, and of course, Lishuat Kiviti Hashem. Now the Chumash, let's just wrap up the chapter first of all. Kol Eileh Shivtei Yisrael Shnei Masar. All of these sons of Jacob are also tribes. That's an important point. That when he's blessing his sons individually, it's not just about the sons, because he's talking about the land that they will someday possess in the land of Canaan. That means that he's talking to his sons as sons, but he's also seeing these sons as the forerunners of the tribes, of the Shvatim. The transition from family to nation is implicit, says the Torah, in the blessings that Yaakov has conferred upon these 12 sons. And the Torah emphasizes here the blessings. So again, sometimes the greatest blessing can be a critique because it helps you see things in the right way. In any event, they're all included, and that's the point. Now we have his final speech to all of his children. So he says to his children, I'm dying, gather to my people, bury me together with my ancestors in the cave, which is in the field of Ephron the Hittite. He had already spoken to Joseph back in the end of chapter 47, and Joseph swore he would take him back. And Yaakov says, don't bury me in Egypt, but take me back and bury me with my ancestors. Then he said to Joseph alone, because only Joseph can actually make it happen. The brothers have no power to make that happen. You have to go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh that you want the father of the viceroy of Egypt to be buried in a foreign land. He's not going to be happy with it, we understand. But the only one who could possibly make it happen is Joseph. So presumably, Yaakov is now assuming that Joseph will be able to swing this. And now he speaks to all of his children, not just Joseph. Bury me together with my ancestors. And he's very specific. The grave which was purchased, which is in the field of Ephron. He describes the exact place where it is. In the cave, in the field of Machpelah, which is near Mamre in the land of Canaan. Asher kana Avraham et hasadeh meyet Ephron hachiti la'achuzat kaver. That Abraham bought from Ephron as a permanent possession of a grave. Achuzat kever. He continues. Shama kavru et Avraham v'et Sarah ishto, and there Abraham and Sarah are buried. Shama kavru et Yitzchak v'et Rivka ishto, and there Isaac and Rebekah were buried. V'shama kavarti et Leah, and there I buried Leah. Here we discover that Leah had died, that Yaakov buried her there. There's no recording of her death, actually. The first time we ever hear about this, that Leah is actually buried there. And he continues. He continues with this. The land which Jacob bought, the field and the cave, the Sadeh and the Marah, which Jacob bought, which Avram bought from Bnei Chet. So these are Jacob's last words. So let me just make a couple of comments about this, and if people want to speak up, Vakasha. But first of all, when you read these verses, you realize the incredible significance of this particular purchase. It's the last thing Yaakov says. It's not the blessings to his children. He blessed his children and he died. No. The last thing he says is, here's where you bury me. And what he emphasizes is a couple of things. First of all, that this particular place is our possession. It's not just a grave. It's achuzat kever. The word achuza is a very, very important word. It means a permanent possession. Eretz achuzatchem is the land that you really, as much as something can be fully yours, that's the word achuza. And he goes out of his way to make the point that it was bought. Verse number 32. It was bought from Ephron. The field and the cave were bought from Ephron, from Bnei Chet, by Abraham. It's ours. That's the point he's making. This is ours. And on top of that, in addition to it being ours, but it's ours, it's a family plot. Avram and Sarah are buried there, Yitzchak and Rivka buried there, and Leah is buried there as well. I want to be buried with Leah, he says, and with my parents and my grandparents. That's my last command, my last wish. And I want you all to bury me. Not just Joseph can go up with whatever. No, all of you. Kivru oti el avotai. So you realize the extent to which this is significant. And actually, this was yesterday's Torah reading. Parshat Chayei Sarah. If you remember in the Torah reading, it's actually very interesting that Abraham, after Sarah dies, he's mourning for Sarah, and he talks to Bnei Chet. And he says to Bnei Chet, back in chapter 23, he says, I want you to allow me, to give me permission, or to give me a place to bury my wife. That's in chapter, just read it to you in chapter 23, right beginning of chapter 23. He says, Ger toshav anochi machem. Chapter 23, verse 4. I am a stranger and sojourner with you. Tnuli achuzat kever imachem. V'yekbara meti milfonai. Give me an achuzat kever, a possession of a grave. That verse right there. So in other words, so the response of Bnei Chet in verse 5 and 6 is, listen, you're a great person. You're a prince of a man amongst us. Bury your dead wherever you wish. None of us will withhold his grave from you. So they're assuming what Avram is saying is, I have to bury my wife. I don't have a plot. Maybe somebody can help me out. Oh, of course. What's the question? You're a prince of a man. Anybody who's happy to give a grave to you, kivro. And what Avram says is, essentially, that's not really what I'm asking for. I'm not asking for a place to bury Sarah. I'm not asking for a kever. I'm asking for something else, which is a chuzat kever, a possession of a grave. I don't want to bury her in your graves. I want you permit me on your field to bury her. Thank you. That's very generous. But that's not what I want. I want a chuzat kever. I want the grave to be my grave. And the fact of the matter is that the term achuzat kever appears in the Avram story 3 times. It appears here, it appears later, and it appears at the very end of chapter 23 when the Torah says that in fact it happened. So the idea of this kever, which is Sarah's grave initially, Sarah's grave is the possession that represents the fact that Avram has a possession in the land, that it's Avram's land. It's not staying in their land, but this is our possession now, which someday will represent the fact that the land is ours. That's achuzat kever. And in order to make sure that it's his, he says, put me in touch with Ephron, and I will pay the full price for the grave. The grave is at the edge of Ephron's field. Asher b'ktsei sadeu, at the edge of his field. Now, in this story, so he meets with Ephron. You must have heard about Ephron. And you remember in the story, this is chapter 23, Ephron, who dwells amongst Bnei Chet, in verse number 10, Ephron says to Avram in verse 11, says, listen, he says, because Avram had said, I'll buy from Ephron, I buy the grave for the full price, kesef molei. I want to pay the full price. Kesef molei. I'm not trying to bargain with this guy. Whatever he wants, I'll pay the full price. That's verse number 9. When Ephron meets Abraham, though, in verse 10, he says in verse 11, no, he says, Lo Adon Ishmaini. No, you listen to me. Hasodeh latati lach. I'll give you the field. And I'll give you the grave as well, which is in the field. It's at the edge of the field. You don't have to pay me anything. You can have the field and you can have the grave. That's what he says, or seems to say on the surface. But Avram, and I think we, the reader, hear something else, which is, you want the grave, you want to possess the grave at the edge of my field? You can possess the grave at the edge of my field, provided that you also possess the field. You can have both for nothing. You can have the field for nothing and the grave for nothing. But Ephron knows, since Avram has emphasized, he doesn't want it for nothing. He wants to pay, and not just to pay. He wants to pay the full price. So Ephron is essentially saying that the grave is at the edge of the field. That's what graves typically are in fields. They're at the edge. You don't put your graves in the middle of the field. So you're just at the edge of the field, separate from the field in a certain sense. So Ephron says, listen, you can have the grave, provided you take the field as well. For nothing. But he knows it's not for nothing. It's a package deal. And Avram says, fine, I accept it. How much is it? What's the price? Says Ephron, between me and you, for you I have a special deal. He says, between me and you, 400 shekel kesef. If you give me 400 shekels, then we have a deal. And now the point is, you don't have to be an expert in ancient Near Eastern coins to know that 400 shekels is a lot, because the number 400 appears twice other places in Breshit that we came across in our study. One is the 400 years of the covenant. The descendants will be strangers and enslaved and abused for 400 years. It's a very long time. And the second place is when Esav comes towards Yaakov. Yaakov is Esav's coming, with 400 men. He's coming with his army. There's a lot of people. You don't just greet your brother with, you come with a small number of people, not with 400 people. It means a vast amount of money. And Abraham pays it. No problem. And not only that, Arba Me'od Shekel Kesef Over LaSocher, the merchant's rate, Over LaSocher, because the money isn't always usable in those times. But this is number class A money. Everybody will accept it. So he pays an enormous price for something he didn't want in the first place. But having said that, and having purchased the grave and the field, it's even better, because now he owns not only a grave, but he owns the field as well. So the significance of this, achuzat kever, you realize, at the time you realize it's significant. But when you read our verses at the end of chapter 49, you understand the enormous significance. The last thing that Yaakov dwells on, and it's verse 29 and 30, and 31, and 32, 4 verses. The last thing he says is about the fact, not just that he wants to be buried together with his parents, grandparents, and wife, but that we own that place. We bought it, we purchased it. Mikneh, the last verse, Mikneh hasodeh v'amara shabo meyet b'nei chet. That's rather striking, actually, that great significance of what we read yesterday about the purchase of the. And the truth of the matter is, we talk about it's a grave of the Avot and Imahot. Rachel's not buried there. Interesting, by the way, just in passing, is that when Yaakov talks about who is buried there, it says there they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah, his wife. There I buried Leah, he says. He doesn't say, there I buried Leah, my wife. From Yaakov's standpoint, kissing my wife Leah, because his real wife is Rachel. The one he loves is Rachel. He buried Leah there. She's also buried there. She's also my wife, but the ishti is missing in this verse. Very striking, actually. In any event,
Rabbi Silber,
yes.
just a very quick thing. The thing imachem, Abraham was trying to kind of wine and dine. I'm just like you. So it sort of boomeranged, and then he had to express himself. He's saying, I'm just like you, I just want to have a little burial. He's the first one to say it. It was his beginning. But he does say,
but he does say, even when he first talks to them, he uses the term achuzat kever. In other words, I think that when Avram says, give me a grave, tainly, or permit me, what he's really angling for is that it's his. He doesn't want the field. I'm not saying the field he buys because he has no choice.
Right.
Because Ephron doesn't want to give him sell him
right.
the grave.
Starts off angling, and then it gets put in his face. He has to get out of it.
Right, but I don't think he doesn't seem to mind paying the money. He has no problem with the money. Money's there to be used appropriately. It doesn't bother him actually. But I did want to make one last point about this particular command or request that Yaakov is making at the end of his life. He's actually, the next verse says, Vayichal Yaakov with Savot et Banav. Jacob completed with Savot is not a request. They translate giving, it literally means to command. He's giving commands over here. He's not just requesting. He gathered his feet into the bed and he dies. So to the very end, Yaakov is instructing his children. I want to make one last point about this story of the death of Yaakov, and what leads into the next chapter that we'll see next week, hopefully. And that is that in the book of, first of all, let me make the simple point that the piece of land that represents Israel's possession of the land is actually Sarah's grave. Yeah, Avram is buried there afterwards, and Rivka and Yitzchak and Yaakov and Leah, but it's initially the grave of Sarah. Avram buys it for Sarah. And that actually is very appropriate because it's Sarah actually who understood the way the covenant is to proceed. But more than that, there's something else I want to conclude with the following observation about Sefer Breshit. Next week, hopefully, we'll finish the Sefer Breshit. I mean, you never finish it, but we'll finish it for this particular machzor. Anyway, in the book of Genesis, so the deaths of the matriarchs and patriarchs are recorded. I mean, the death of Rachel is recorded. Here we hear that Leah died and Rivka died, but their deaths are not when they. We don't know when they died. The Torah doesn't tell us. We know they did die and they're buried in Marat Machpelah. Avram, of course, is Yitzchak's deaths are recorded, but the point is that in two of the cases, there is a lot of attention paid to the mourning of these two people, and the two people that the Chumash emphasizes in Sefer Bereshit about all the family is mourning and crying for them. In the first instance, it's the death of Sarah that we read yesterday. And then the whole chapter is about finding a burial place for Sarah, which of course has implications way beyond Sarah, but the focus is on Sarah. And the other person that the Chumash spends even more time on in terms of the death and funeral is, of course, the very next chapter of Yaakov. There's a very lengthy description of the way that Yaakov is to be taken out of the land of Egypt, brought up to the land of Canaan, is buried by his children. There's a whole discussion we'll see next week, hopefully, about that. But there's an entire chapter about this and the mourning and the crying for Jacob. The Egyptians are crying for Jacob, the brothers cry for Jacob, Joseph cries for Jacob. And we have to ask the question, why did the Torah actually emphasize these two people, Sarah and Yaakov, are the two people that the Chumash spends a lot of time emphasizing that with their death, there's a kind of a very deep mourning for these people. I think the point of it is this, actually. The book of Reshit is about the building of the family, of course, over 4 generations, and the terms of the covenant that God makes with Abraham and that Yaakov has referenced, I pointed out earlier, both in chapter 48 and 49, the Brit Ben Abitarim, is that when Avram says, through what will I know that we will possess the land? And God's answer is, we're going to suffer for 400 years, Gerut and Avdut and Inui. Now, Gerut, Avdut, and Inui, those are the terms that God uses in chapter 15. But of course, in chapter 15, there's going to be the suffering in the future. God doesn't say where, but without question, one of the places, maybe the primary place, it will be in the land of Egypt. The very beginning of Sefer Shemot, and we'll see this hopefully in a few weeks, is about Gerut, Avdut, and Inui. That's what it's about. Now, where's this coming from, this Gerut and Avdut and Inui? Where do we have in the Chumash? This is chapter 15. But what is it building off? And of course, what it's building off is that we've already gone down to Egypt. Because in chapter 12, Avram goes down to Egypt. And in fact, when he went down to Egypt, Sarah is taken by Paro. And who knows how long she's with him. And she can't leave. So the person who's a ger and an eved and undergoes inui is none other than our matriarch Sarah. And when God says to Abraham in chapter 15, this is what's going to happen in the future, that Israel will suffer in the future, and then they will possess the land. What that blessing, what that promise is about is that essentially what has already taken place in your life, Abraham, because in chapter 14, Abraham symbolically possesses the land. He captures the land, the battle with the 4 kings. Where we have the Gerut and the Avdut and the Inui, that's the story of Sarah. Abraham doesn't suffer in Egypt. He does okay for himself. Comes out with a lot of money, a lot of gold and silver and cattle and all kinds of gifts. Sarah is the one who undergoes the suffering. And the other person to undergo the Gerut and Avdut and Inui in the book of Bereshit, of course, is Yaakov. It's the story of Yaakov in the house of Lavan, where the Chumash uses exactly those terms. Avadaticha ba'asrei shana. Et onyi v'yetigia kapai rohim v'yochach omash in chapter 31, as we studied. And in chapter 32, he sends a message to Esav, im Lavan garti, Gerut, Avdut, and Inui. So the 2 people, actually, that undergo the Gerut, Avdut, and Inui in the book of Genesis are firstly Sarah, whose experience is reformulated by God in those terms. The Chumash doesn't say Sarah in Mitzrayim was a ger or shivcha and had Avdut and Inui, but when God speaks to Abraham, it's clear that the reference is to what Sarah has undergone, not Abraham. Sarah is the one who represents the suffering, and that suffering is the integral piece which allows ultimately the covenant to be fulfilled, God to fulfill God's part of the bargain. And the other is Sarah's grandson, probably named for Sarah, among other things, Yisrael. Her name is Sarah. He's Yisrael. And the point of the Chumash, I think, which is a very important point, is that people who have suffered to allow other people to move forward in life and to receive the blessings that God has promised, those are the people that have to be recognized. It's easy to forget these people. But these are the people who make these sacrifices, and those are the people that we have to keep foremost in our minds. I'm thinking right now about all our young people who have been killed in Israel and fighting, some of whom indirectly, I know, I'm sure we all know some of them. And the fact of the matter is, they're making sacrifices on behalf of the Jewish people, and they are working to protect the Jewish people. Those are the people we have to be first and foremost in our thinking. That's what the Chumash is saying over here. It's those people that set it up. Yaakov says about himself to Pharaoh, how old are you? Not as old as you think. I've had a tough life. And he has had a very tough life. But at the end of the day, he's the great hero because he's the one who makes it possible for others to move forward. You know, it's interesting. I want to mention one thing before I stop you, and that is, you know, Drisha has a yeshiva in Israel. It's in Kfar Etzion. It's the most amazing thing I've ever done, actually. It's an amazing place. We were supposed to, it's growing. We got 53 students. They were in morning, afternoon, and evening. Women. It's a real yeshiva. But of course, with this war and everything, so of course they are learning, but they're also helping out. And in Kfar Etzion, they do all kinds of stuff because Kfar Etzion itself adopted a community from the south called Shlomit. And the yeshiva has been growing. We were supposed to take some dorm rooms in Kfar Etzion, some additional dorm space. But we didn't take the dorm space because living in those dorms right now are people from the south. People from Shlomit are living in our dorms. So apart from the fact that we are helping, I mean, it's unbelievable how much is being done. But I'm very proud of the fact that with all that and all the help they're doing, they're still maintaining the learning, which is important as well. So anyway, we're thinking all the time about these people, and we are praying, as Jacob did, Mishuratcha kiviti Hashem. We pray for your salvation. Have a good week. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
So, Dara,
You're Rabbi. Thank you.
And if people want to join us for more learning, today with Rabbi Silber, we have the class on Mishnah Yomit. Yevamot at 1 p.m. Eastern over Zoom. You can find out more about our Fallsmon classes at 5784.drisha.org/fall. Have a good day, all.